Welcome to the LGLCI two-part series on rotational grazing economics. In this series, we'll explore the financial side of rotational grazing, breaking down the costs, benefits, and key considerations. Joining us for this discussion is James McCann, NRCS Louisiana's Ag Economist, who will share his insights and expertise to provide a clearer understanding of the economics behind rotational grazing. Let's dive into part one.
My name is Tara Morris. I'm here with James McCann, our state NRCS economist, and I work for Louisiana GLCI. Today, we're going to have sort of a producer economist conversation of some data that James has been running about the economic benefits of rotational grazing. Does it actually pay? Is it worth the effort? Is it worth the infrastructure changes up front? And James and I have had some solid conversations to do this research for two previous presentations that he's done already. So it's just time for us to lay this out in a webinar type format so that we can have this recorded and available for lots of people to be able to use this information. James, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tara. Thanks for having me. So let's jump in. I'll share my screen and we'll go over some of the slides, some of the data that we looked at. And I want you all to know today that I'm trying to approach this from a bird's eye view. I'm not trying to say that every individual producer's farm is the same. Everybody doesn't have a cookie cutter place, but in order to come up with some answers, we need to hold some assumptions true so that we can look at, okay, what is the data really saying about the idea of rotational grazing? So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. And so rotational grazing economics. Before we get started on the actual case study, I kind of want to go over where we can find our cost and benefits. So if you're familiar with rotational grazing, it's a livestock management practice where animals are moved between different paddocks at regular intervals. In order to accomplish this task, we need to do two things: divide the grazing area, rotate the livestock. And so with that, there's a whole lot of things that come with cost and benefits in order to achieve both of these goals. On the cost side, we have interior fencing cost. It could be labor intensive. Like I said, it's not for everybody. If this is side income for you and you have a job that's very demanding, how much time does it take you to go move those every day? Are you physically able and capable? Water availability. Do you have a centrally located water facility, or do you need livestock pipeline? Do you need something that you can move around? There's 100 different ways to do it. On the benefits side, initially it might sound a little qualitative, but there are quantitative benefits. And so we're going to try to dig into what those are. At the top, improve forage productivity, right? We're trying to get the forage, the rest and recovery periods to be exactly equal to the livestock feeding demand, and try to meet that because managing grass should be cheaper than buying grain. And that's kind of the whole thought process behind this of utilizing forage productivity. Manure distribution. There's nutrients there. It's very valuable. Instead of having it all loaded onto one spot, we can distribute it throughout the field, and hopefully that adds to our soil fertility and helps us have better plant biomass and better forage productivity. And then the other thing is drought resiliency. Knowing that our roots are deeper and rest and recovery happens, we can weather the storms. We had a terrible drought here recently, and times with no rain, those roots can still dig deep into the soil and do well. So let's get into it. And Tara, feel free to butt in whenever you want to. And I can even hop over and share some of the Excel spreadsheets that I used to really come up with this. So first and foremost, the heftiest portion of the cost column is going to be your fencing. What are you going to use to divide the smaller paddocks? There's a slew of options. You have woven wire, barbed wire fence, high tensile fence, both electric and non-electric, and you have poly electric. All of these comes, with preferential decision making and a cost and a price tag behind it. So what I did was I wanted to come out with a cost breakdown of fencing per quarter mile and see on a scale what was going to be the most expensive and what was the least expensive, and include all the things that you need, not just the fence itself, but the wooden posts, the clips, um, the labor and equipment to put it in, and then break that down on a per foot basis. So as you can see with a bar chart below, this was 2024. Things can get outdated pretty quick. But for 2024, woven wire fence was the most expensive at $2.78 a foot. By wire fence, $2.24. High tensile non-electric wire, $1.80. High tensile electrified fence, $1.39. And then only 43 cents a foot for electric poly fence. So, Tara, do you have anything that you'd like to say on this?
Yeah, and just to clarify, when you say on high tensile non-electric, that's essentially a smooth wire fence, which
Yes.
probably would not, non-electrified would not work for cattle necessarily, maybe in a horse situation, but not necessarily a cattle
Yeah.
operation. And then, of course, with a sheep operation or a goat, small ruminant animal situation, you would really need that woven wire fence. Now, James, I know you work for NRCS. Are these specs and cost calculations based on NRCS, or is this based on your current research on this project?
So actually, this is a little separate. I decided to take specs and standards that were pretty average for Mississippi Southwest Delta region for how these fences were built. With NRCS specs, we standard and specs, we have different things with your stays and spacings, and so I'm sure that most of these would pass. I'll take my word for it, but I just wanted to see on an average daily basis what was needed and how people were actually building these fences, because my goal is to get to y'all is whatever y'all see and how on average typical situation these fences are built. That's the cost I want to come up with, because our programs, we hope that people can get in, but that's not always the case. And so I wanted to be realistic with how these things were built. And some people might change. Some people might not use as much 8-inch diameter wood post. Some people might use more 4-inch. This is just what I've seen. It was kind of a conglomerate study with A&M, Texas Tech, a little bit of Oklahoma and Nebraska, and they all pretty much were using the same type of spacings and same type of support systems, and threw in Louisiana cost with their spacing and quantities and labor as well. So that was kind of my heart behind it and my approach that I took to it, because not everybody's going to build something to NRCS standard. So
Sure, and that makes it a lot more practical. So thank you for using kind of
yeah,
real time,
yeah,
data that producers typically do.
absolutely, absolutely. So and like I guess it depends. I guess I have questions too of with this fencing, there's a couple of options or preferences that you would have. Is how much do you like to work with it? Is it movable and mobile for you? Is it something that your animals respect? If you're not handling them every day, you need to also choose. It might be more expensive to do something, but if you know that you're not handling them every single day, then maybe you need to make that heftier investment. And so I think there's a lot here besides economics. There's a lot of qualitative just preferences of, would Brahma respect electric poly fence? I don't know that, but y'all would, and y'all make that decision. So
Yeah, and it looks like we're installing 1,320 feet of fence. And so that's assuming there's already a perimeter fence for those people
mhm.
who are not utilizing this yet. We're assuming that there's already a perimeter fence around one pasture, and we're simply dividing it. And did you have that mapped out yet on a?
the pre- no, in the case study I did, but I just assume, and we'll get into it later, but this is for interior fencing is the purpose for it. This pricing I feel confident on if you're building perimeter fence, but when we're looking at a change in management, such as going into rotational grazing, we're assuming you already have a perimeter fence because yeah. So we're looking at the cost difference of what's happening from going from continuous to rotational. So the thing that would be changing is interior fencing. So that's why I put this out there. But yeah, I hope that answers it.
It
Okay.
sure does. And not to take it over too much, but that electric polywire cost sure is low. That's pretty amazing. Does that include a charger?
It does. It includes a charger. Actually, if you want to, I mean, I can even send out an email and come up with a better sheet. I have every single one of these broken down, and just like how you see the barbed wire fence up here broken out into every column, I did that for electric poly, and it included an energizer in it. So
Yeah, that might be some great resources for our blog in the future for people to really look at and analyze and be
absolutely.
able to add some inflation because these are based on 2024 summer
Hmm.
approximate prices. And then now it's January 2025. Inflation's been insane this past year. So yeah, we could take that and provide that as a resource. So thank you.
Absolutely. I would love that. So I guess piggyback off that, this is, what you would experience in 2024, or depending on how price changes even around you, this is what you would experience whenever you're going to actually buy it. However, there's a whole nother cost. There is ownership. So there is a price tag, and sometimes it's easy to forget, kind of like me right now. Like I love having a paid off truck, but it's still costing me something to drive it. And everybody, we don't feel the depreciation until the repair bill comes in, and we live off of that depreciation. So it's smart to go ahead and think about the future. How much does it actually cost me, a dollar per foot per year, just for that fence to stand? And there's some assumptions in here that you may disagree with, and that's fine. I tend to lean on the side of conservatism because I know that if I can save that amount for future expenses, then I won't be going into the hole whenever it comes up. So for this, I had to include a useful life for depreciation to get a depreciation calculation. Interest on investment is one that isn't thought about a lot. I think about it a ton. That's basically the opportunity cost that you have to take your money instead of having it tied up into the fence and the repair and depreciation, that you could have spent your money elsewhere and got a return on investment. So you could just as well put more money in your retirement fund, or maybe there was a separate business that needed a little bit more attention, and you could have had attention, and you could have had better returns off of it. So there is actually ownership cost and the opportunity of where else you could have spent your money. Um, and then maintenance, obviously, everybody's favorite thing to do, to repair fences. And so um, everything on here, it follows for sure what the installation cost would be. With woven wire, it was most expensive at 58 cents per foot per year. Bob wire, 47 cents. Um, high tensile non-electric, 36 cents. High tensile electric, 28 cents. And electrified poly wire. And I will say that some of this, no one will have the same experiences. So I think Tara, you use electric fencing and poly, and I think you've had a very successful story on the useful life of it. However, just with standards and specs and what I see off of a lot of other people's calculations is we expect the useful life to be 10 years on
Mhm.
electric fence. So I worked off of that, and that's going to factor into the depreciation amount.
Uh,
So,
James,
you
it
know,
comes down to how many hogs decide to go through it on your bottom strand, or
yeah,
how many calves decide to chew on it if you leave it unelectrified or not strong enough. There's a lot of factors there on the quality of your fence going forward, and how hot your cows are temperament wise, and even woven wire. I saw a farm recently that had some beautiful woven wire, and he did really thought that his cattle would not push on it or struggle with it. But I think during a roundup one time, they just smashed a piece of it. So just kind of, we'll talk about cattle disposition economics another partial budget time.
yes, absolutely. So what you're talking about there is the average annual maintenance percentage. And like how I said earlier, we have to make assumptions just to put a dollar value behind something because I know everything's gray. But in my looking in research, it is a wide range. It is anywhere from 5% on the low end to it could be 15% for reasons that you just named. So I gave it an 8% just because I don't know. I would assume if someone's going into rotational grazing that not that you have everything in control, but these animals hopefully are being handled. Maybe you would have a little bit less maintenance because you're seeing it every day. You can address things before they pop up. and solve it right then and there instead of having incidents occur later on. So just an interesting thing to think about, that it costs something for that fence just to be standing there, even after you buy everything and after it's up and you have pride in it and you can look at it and it's working. There's still a cost to that. So I would assign that a cost just to have in the back of your mind, and you're paying it whether you know it or not, in your time and your labor, and the materials that you need to fix it. So I thought this was worthy. Moving on. Okay, this is a very interesting, very debatable topic, and I'm very open for a conversation. But a lot of this, I'm not doing to say that you're going to pocket this money and that it's going to be profitable and that you could take this to the bank. I'm doing it to show that there is value. So in economic terms or accounting, there's a gross value and there's a net value. Gross value in this situation would be, okay, we know that manure has value, and how can we compare that to something? Well, the other thing that has nutrients and value would be synthetic fertilizers. So we can look at the commercial fertilizer price and how much of that is in manure and come up with a gross value. However, that's going to be completely different than what the net value is. The net value is once you actually apply the manure, it gets worked into the soil biology. How much is it actually going to the forage productivity and growth and soil fertility, and it incurring a benefit? And not a lot of people do it, but if you fertilize your pasture, what would a soil test, if it was accurate enough, tell you a reduction in NPK, how much you would actually need once that manure is distributed? So if you see what I'm saying, there's a lot of variables that come out here that I'm not going to be able to put an exact dollar amount on the net value, but at least we can come up with a gross value to say for certain it has value and we should treat it as such. You know, I think that's an important concept behind being a good steward and getting into conservation is we know that it has value. We might not know exactly what it is, but if you don't want to pay interest or operating loans or go buy expensive fertilizer and you know this has value, then treat it as value, you know, and that's my heart behind this. So I took this study. It could be very different from Nebraska. What they decided to do was they wanted to do manure sampling and break out the nutrients within a ton of manure and see how much NPK, sulfur, and zinc existed in that ton of manure. What they found in organic nitrogen was almost 13 pounds. Phosphorus was, again, almost 13 pounds, 12.7. Potassium, 12.5. Sulfur, 2.8. And a little bit of zinc, 0.2. Ammonium nitrogen, they said pretty much to their experience, volatilized as soon as it hit the ground. It never really worked its way into the soil. And so they tried to look a little bit at the net value. And so I was trying to put some dollars behind it. So the graph on this right-hand side that you see, if y'all can follow along with me, the amount of nitrogen found in a ton of manure was 12.9 pounds. And they claim that in year one from the sampling that they did, 40% would be available to the soil, and that would help with forage productivity. So if 40% was available in year one, that would mean that 5 pounds and 16 ounces would be available for year one. As we know, sometimes these organic fertilizers and manure, it takes a little bit longer to work into the soil. And they found that there was actually more that was available stretching out to year three. 35% of it was available in year three. And that would be 4 pounds and 51. So what happened is what I'm trying to see here is from year 1 to 3, that means the total pounds of nitrogen would be almost 10 pounds of nitrogen was found in manure per ton. So I'm trying to find the total amount of nutrients found in manure that was distributed across this field on a per ton basis. I also don't know if this is really true. They said also in that study that it would take 31 beef cows to produce a ton of manure per day. However, my concerns with this is maybe it sounds pretty liberal that they said that, but I don't know if that is wet or if urine was mixed in with it. That changes everything. And we know that, but I just thought it was a fun tidbit to add in there because a ton sounds like a lot to us, but whenever we think about how much is actually being out there, maybe it's really not that much at all. Maybe there's a lot more nutrients available than there really are. So I just think this is very interesting. Tara, you probably have something to add on it, and feel free to play the devil's advocate because I probably
Yeah, yeah, James, my brain is going to what would this look like in the deep south? Because Nebraska's forages are going to be quite a bit drier than ours, from my understanding. And regionally, I would think this would change a ton, maybe literally a ton, because
yeah,
of the amount of water and in our forages compared to the drier forages out west. I would think that this could be a really great study for someone to do in the deep south to really,
hmm
and I would think also your soil nutrients that are on that left column as far as phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, zinc could really change depending on the soils you're on.
right. Oh yeah, I definitely think so. And who knows? I mean, um, maybe even some of the nutrients actually would it could be slower in some of the heavier clay soils. I really don't know. Maybe it holds just on the top of it and it doesn't work its way down. I really don't know. I'd be curious to see, but
But yeah, I think
I
the
mean,
overarching theme of taking that into consideration to know that I see you don't have dollar amounts here, and that's valuable because that did you add dollar amounts into your study for this or not?
I did. So the next slide, what I did was I took, okay, I just ran y'all through an example of how much nitrogen from year 1 to 3 would exist in a ton of manure, which it sounds like if it is true that if 31 beef cows produce a ton of manure in a day, well, if you had 50 or 100 and they're out there, you know, 365 days, that is that's a lot of nutrients. And that's kind of what was going through my mind is, we're looking at this as a scientific, isolated space, but in the real world, that's a lot of nutrients. I wouldn't want to be confident and say 31 is exactly a day per ton. We can work that out maybe in another study. I think it would be a good study for the Deep South. Um, but how I would run with that, once you came up with the quantity, is now we can look at, okay, NPK prices for 2024 was about 59 cents a pound of active ingredient, P 75 cents, and K was 43 cents. And so I ran with those, the quantities that we had for NPK and multiplied those prices for 2024. And then you can see the value per ton of manure that was available in those 3 years. And so you add that together, your $5.71, $7.14, $4.03. And from a gross value, NPK value per ton of manure would be $16.88 in 2024. You have a year like 2023 where prices were much higher for inputs, then you're looking at higher values. So that manure all of a sudden becomes even more valuable because now the nutrients are much more costly. And if you did the same thing for 2023, it would be $23.43. So, I'm just basically looking at nutrients, how their values do go up and down whenever you compare them to commercial fertilizers. I just think it's really neat to know that, $16.88. I'm not saying that you're going to pocket that money and that's profit margin right there. But if you could any way um, help yourself by knowing that it is a value, um, then I think that that's going to put you ahead. And I think you're going to see that in your forage growth. And that's really the goal of this. And so, yeah, I hope I'm making that clear that I'm not saying that, okay, you can count on a reduction in your expense column by $16 because you also wouldn't incur uh, any benefit if you never fertilize your pasture. And a lot of people won't. So this is just something to prove that as far as economics go, there is value in doing it. But how you view fertilizing your pasture or soil testing, that depends on you and if you actually incur this in your pocket or not.
Yeah, and I think it's important to also, James, to talk about the structure of, the basic structure of rotational grazing, not just taking necessarily one pasture, just knowing the concepts here about, do you have that already in another slide? Am I jumping ahead about the
Um,
concepts?
I don't, maybe continue though. It sounds great.
Yeah, I have a rotational grazing chart, just an extremely basic hand-drawn chart of here's one rectangular pasture. And let's say we divide that in half. So in that first large pasture, you're going to distribute all this manure, no matter the value of it. You're distributing it very vaguely all over the rectangle. And your grasses are going to typically be overgrazed in that situation because there's no rest period there. Versus when you tighten, even if you were dividing into two, or you divide it into 4 or 6 or 8, then you're tightening all your manure distribution onto those smaller paddocks. And that's what really multiplies your value here is it's tightening the manure into places where you can start to see the value of this a whole lot faster. Because as you know, if you're a cattle farmer or you have a paddock or a pasture of cattle, they tend to gravitate towards certain areas. Like ours love to really pound on any Bermuda grass spots. They have their favorite spots that they pound and tend to drop a lot of manure on. Same with during the wintertime when we're putting out hay. That's kind of a valuable spot that they're dropping a lot of manure. So it's this mind shift of strategically thinking about manure. Now, who knew we would ever be saying that? But it is a very strategic point. And I do, looking at these values and doing just a little math on myself and thinking about, if a cow patty weighs 2 to 3 pounds and they poop 8 times a day, I'm still only coming up with 500 pounds per cow. I mean, I'm sorry, for 31 cows, about 500 pounds of manure a day. So whether or not these are elevated or not, it could need some adjusting here just to play the devil's advocate a little bit.
Absolutely.
But I think it's still valuable to look and see, okay, take that $16.88 divided by 4 even. And that still comes out to $4, give or take, of value per day on 31 cattle. So it's taking that and just strategically placing it into a spot, I think is really valuable. And that's all I had on that, James.
Absolutely. That's great. And you might want to edit it out, but I was just thinking, this just proves that crap matters. You can't go through life thinking that it doesn't. So anyway, I had to say that. This is a really good study, just backing what Tara said. This is probably the only study that I felt like captured and was viable economically what continuous versus rotational grazing did. There was one in the Southeast, and there was one by South Dakota. That was it. There's not a lot of studies out there, which made my job a little bit more difficult because it was harder to see how people really approach this. So let's start with the bottom left. The bottom left, you can see the carbon stocks on the y-axis running vertically, and then the x-axis, you have the grazing type. AMP being the multi-paddock grazing, rotational grazing, what we're talking about. It's a little bit different, but kind of same concept. Continuous grazing is on the right, CG, and you can really see the difference in carbon stocks between the rotational grazing and continuous grazing. And then same thing with the bar chart to the right of it, it says nitrogen stocks is on the y-axis, and on the x-axis again, rotational grazing and continual grazing. And this just shows me same kind of story of like, okay, if your manure is distributed and your rest and recovery periods are existing and can meet the feeding demand, then you're saving the nitrogen into the soil for it to be, for that plant to be able to take up the nutrients and be healthier and give that, for hopefully that equals weight gain. That's what the end product is, and that's what we're all hoping is. I love being a nerd about grass and soil just as much as anyone, but at the end of the day, what is it going to do for weight gain, and or how will it cut my expenses? And whenever I can see that, well, my nitrogen stocks are higher, my carbon stocks are higher, and then particularly on the right, I really like this one. This was the South Dakota study. So this is going to be very foreign stocking rates because it's rangeland. So bear with me. They didn't even get up to a quarter cow per acre. But on the right-hand side, forgive me, I'm colorblind, but I think this is green or orange. I don't know which.
Orange. Uh-huh.
Orange. Okay. So that orange is continuous. That orange is rotational grazing. And then the left, the blue, is continuous. On the y-axis, you're looking at plant biomass, which is a direct indicator of forage productivity. And so what I think that's really neat here is we see that the rotational grazing still supports the plant biomass as the stocking rate is increasing. So from 0.06 up to 0.14, rotational grazing plant biomass barely decreases, it differs. Whereas with your blue continuous grazing, the plant biomass is shrinking and falling off as soon as you increase your stocking rate. And so this is going to be the big story that we kind of get into of, okay, like everybody wants to know the silver bullet question of, is rotational grazing profitable? Well, it also depends on where you're starting from. If your goal is to increase stocking rate and you can hold more animals and your weight, ending weight and your weight gain is the same, then yeah, absolutely. But that's going to depend on what your plant biomass, your forage productivity. And so this really shows scientifically how that could be achieved with rotational grazing, because for sure there is not a large drop off at all. When increasing your stocking rate all the way to 0.22, your plant biomass never even fell to 0.4. Whereas with continuous, it just fell off really sharp. And so I hope that graph really does illustrate something. I know it's hard to look at ratios and numbers and think conceptually what that means. But yeah, Tara, do you have anything that you'd like to say about that? It's kind of a different bar chart, but.
No, it sounds good, James. I think that makes a lot of sense. It looks like what you're saying, and what I'm hearing is that biomass of the plants decreased a little bit with a managed pasture situation versus continuous, but it was more significantly decreased in a continuous grazing situation over time. And I'm assuming that's over a few years or a few months or
Yeah,
what?
this was actually this was a 5-year study.
Okay.
And that's the other thing that like I only trusted a few sources because as we know with anything conservation or soil biology, it's really long-term impacts. And that's really hard for me to swallow as an economist. I like annual budgets. I like reductions now. I like to see the here and now. But to be honest, soil biology and conservation are really long-term impacts. So seeing that the study was done on a 5-year basis, and they looked at stocking rates and plant biomass and nitrogen stocks and carbon stocks, was really valuable that they went out to a 5-year time period, because a lot of people will do it on a yearly basis and then say there was no significant change at all. And rotational grazing doesn't matter. It doesn't justify the infrastructure cost up front, because continuous you can get the same results. And I don't find that to be the truth once you get out to year 5 and particularly year 10. So.
And what was the rotational period on this study? Was it, when we're talking about rotational grazing, I think what I'm understanding, James, is that you dug into these more management. AMP is what is that called? Adaptive managed grazing,
Yeah.
where we're talking about moving on a daily and at the most weekly basis on the cattle, not just simply 3 weeks here and 3 weeks there.
Correct. Yeah, the bottom left study that was done in the Southeast, that was done, I think, on a daily basis, and it was very intense. I just kind of grabbed that because it at least proved the science that if you were intense in your management and rotating them, then you did see this result in the soil. And that study, I believe, was only out to 3 years, but they had already been doing AMP grazing. So you could already see the results in the soil. That's another thing that's really hard with research is you need to catch people with their pre-existing management and then switching into rotational grazing. It's like going to the hospital, and if you had the flu before you came in and then you get treated, it's hard to say, okay, well, like, but you were healthy when you went to the doctor, but you already had the flu. It's hard to tell from the pre-existing condition on whether or not the doctor and their prescription actually improved their condition or not, because they had something totally different before they even came in. So we're trying to extrapolate variables here and figure out, okay, what was happening before, and then what impact does it have when we go into it. So yeah, it was I have actually more on that study, the stocking rate impacts on plant biomass. That was a 5-year study in South Dakota. That rotation was done on a weekly basis, but it was done on a rangeland. So it's very intense for rangeland, but it was very large because it's like 1,000 acres and very different numbers. So it was intense for them. For us, it wouldn't look as intense, but here's that study. They did something very interesting here that I really appreciated. Is they broke out, before you get confused with the rainbow here, they broke out every single line according to investment, the startup costs to get in rotational grazing, which I thought was very smart because, as I mentioned earlier, your profit margin and payback period is going to differ largely to what your needs are on your operation. So starting at the highest orange bar, that was your lowest cost scenario, meaning, okay, you only need cross fencing. This is all that you need, and they did this across 1,000 acres. So it was really cheap, is what I'm trying to say. Is the economies of scale, the way it works, and I'm sure y'all know this, is the larger of a scale it's done on a per acre basis, it's going to be cheaper for them. You're buying bulk supplies. It's no different than having a membership to Sam's Club and you wonder why it's $1 or $2 cheaper. It's because you're buying in bulk. That's the same concept here. So unfortunately, I think I'll come back to it, but it makes our situation in the Southeast and the Deep South a little bit harder because we're dealing on those smaller acres. So our initial costs are a lot more expensive because we're not spreading out across, thousands of acres. So that top one was their low. They're low at $3 an acre is all they needed to start up. The next one was a medium, and that was like, okay, this is if it was a little bit smaller of an operation to them, and it was 400 acres, and all they needed was fencing. And then they had a high, which was below that. That's that yellow line. And that one, they kept it at 400 acres, but then they said they need livestock pipeline, some water facility help, and a few other things. So it's more expensive, same acreage, but more expensive based on their needs for water. And then we had extra high, which looks like us, Louisiana. Extra high is this very bottom line here. I forgot to mention this diamond blue line this is the main one you want to focus on. This is continuous grazing. Okay. Everything else here is rotational grazing. So what we're really looking like is how does this continuous grazing line look comparatively to the rotational grazing scenarios? And for Louisiana's purpose, I want to focus in on this bottom line because I believe this is actually what I found to be true in the numbers that we crunched in our case study. For this, they pretended like it was on 100 acres, but back then, I hate to say it, back then it was a lot cheaper than it is now. I think this study came from like 2012. So times were different. It's probably more expensive for us now. So keep that in mind as well. So let me break down the story for you. We have net present value. If you know what that is, it's just the current value of a future stream of cash flows. So how much is all the cash flows in the future worth now with a discount rate? Meaning, okay, they can grow, with compounding interest. So let's look first at this very, very low stocking rate because it's rangeland in South Dakota.
Yeah, and James, real quick, just kind of clarify, what is the bottom row telling us, or the column?
Yes, the bottom row is stocking rate, and it's very, very low because it was done on 1,000 acre basis. So their stocking rate, 0.22 isn't even reaching, 0.24 would be a quarter of a cow an acre.
Mhm.
0.06. Should be good at math, but I'm not. I don't even know how much of a cow. It would be very little. I mean, like it wouldn't be a lot.
Yeah, but
So
I think for example purposes, we could almost take this times 10 for Louisiana, just in a scenario type situation. So the beginning, the 0.06 could almost be like zero point 0.6 of a cattle per acre. So that's almost running like 1.2 cattle per acre. Am I correct on that? I mean, per 2 acres?
oh yes, yeah,
If we
yeah,
were to just take an across the board and multiply everything times 10, and that's too generous for our Louisiana stocking rates, but we could to give it that's just a little comparison of kind of
yeah,
working like half of a cow per acre in Louisiana, all the way up to like 2.2 cattle per acre.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And we can do that. The only reason, and I know that this is just so I clarify,
Sure.
the only reason I couldn't do that for this is because even though we can change the ratio to make it make sense in our minds for Louisiana, the same returns wouldn't be realized because these lines would look a lot different based on the net present value. Because this is actually another tidbit of information. This is also different because it's a stocker
Mm,
operation, so it's not a cow calf. So they're focusing on ending weight. They're there for a short period of time. Um, so I wanted to make sure that I was very true. But yes, in your mind, Tara's correct. You can think of it in that terms for Louisiana to make it make sense. But these returns are had with these initial investment costs. But regardless, the reason I put this up um, is the science should be the same, right? Like the law of gravity is experienced here as it is in South Dakota. And so that's the main idea I want to push is we can come to ratios and different dollar values, but the science and the approach should still be the same. Um, with that being said, if we pretended that this very bottom line was Louisiana, um, you would not be making money your first year because you had a hefty initial investment. And if you were to continue with continuous grazing, you would be making money because you're not putting it in interior fencing, you're not putting it in water facilities or anything like that. But what is very interesting to me is when you start to increase your stocking rate, what happens is there comes a point of intersection at 0.16. So the continuous grazing is telling a story that as your stocking rate is increasing, it does not have the capacity to hold um, the herd size. The forage is not resting and recovering. It's just being taken and grazed to the ground, and the roots are shallower and they're not growing back. And so, what I think is really neat is the net present value, the returns that are being had past the 0.16 stocking rate, all they do is fall. That's all they. It's like the law of diminishing returns. I'm more of a row crop budgeter, but it's no different than okay if you're trying to achieve a yield. Let's say it's 160 bushels of corn. You're going to throw out 150 pounds of nitrogen, but maybe every margin you took a soil test past that. If you throw out 180, you would have decreasing returns, meaning that you could throw as much on there as you wanted, but you're not going to impact anything. You can try as hard as you want, but from here it's just falling off. You're wasting money. And that's what we find with a continuous grazing scenario is um, now every blade of grass isn't really being utilized to its full potential. It's actually losing value. It's falling down. And while you're trying to run a business where you can actually hold that animal's feed demand and use every blade of grass and utilize it. So what's
Yeah, yeah.
happening? Yeah.
In a real life situation, just to interject this, it looks to me like at that, what is that, 6 year six, when the stocking rate got all the way up to 0.16, that in a continual grazing situation, first of all, you didn't have much increase in the first place, and then all of a sudden you see this extreme decline. And I think, it sounds to me like the stockers got overstocked and they started losing weight because nobody was getting the nutrition they needed.
Mhm.
There's not enough grass. There there's not enough weight gain because there's not enough forage to do the weight gain. And not only that, then the grasses are grazed down to the roots and they're not able to regrow. You see that with horses a lot. Horses in a dry lot situation, you put them in a grassy area and you think that the horses are going to do fine. Well, every horse owner that I know starts with one horse, and they're kind of the gateway farm animal like chickens are. You start with one, then you add two because, well, two is better than one and they need a buddy. And then you find a great project or a great price and you add three, and all of a sudden you have a dry lot situation here. So that's in real life, that's what I'm seeing with this chart. Is it looks like that ended up being a severely overgrazed pasture.
Correct. And I think it's directly tied, especially for a stocker operation. Whenever you're looking at ending weight, I think something that is really unique here is you see a continuous grazing. Can you see my mouse? I don't know. Okay. Right here, this is the point of inflection. That's as high as a net present value as you get. And then you're tapered off past that. What I find interesting is, okay, you lost money at this stocking rate, you finally made a little bit of profit margin here. But what's interesting to me is the point of inflection for rotational grazing doesn't happen until 0.20, meaning that on a trajectory, you're positively growing and its capacity can hold more and more. The forage is saying that when you manage me right, I'm not done giving. We haven't reached our most profitable level yet. You could see on every single scenario, no matter the cost of investment at the front at 0.20, that is the point where now you're starting to experience decline. Whereas in continuous grazing, you had a way lower stocking rate. So it makes me happy to see that, okay, things might be expensive on the front end. Sure, you might not make the profit at certain stocking rates or at certain years, but the trajectory is overwhelmingly positive. And so this was all economic minded. And I forgot to add one tidbit that I wish I would have said at the beginning. These vertical columns that you're seeing with the graphs, we don't view these as years. These are specifically stocking rates. So when I say 5-year net present value, it's taking the future stream of 5 years of cash flows and looking at how much net present value you would have made like right now if you're at this stocking rate. So, if you ran 5 years at 0.06, yeah, continuous grazing would have outperformed it. It wasn't until 0.16 that if you spent 5 years in rotational grazing, it would have outperformed the continuous grazing system. But still, the science is very true, and I think that this is a really neat thing for those two reasons of the holding capacity and the ability for, as Tara pointed out, the grass to meet the forage demand. But then I like to look at, okay, well, let's look at slope. Y equals mx plus b, high school algebra. The point of inflection right here, you're not getting any greater returns versus you can have a way higher stocking rate. And with rotational grazing, it's not done giving. You're not utilizing every blade of grass in a continuous grazing scenario. And this economic analysis proves that on the 5-year net present value. So
that wraps up part 1 of our 2-part series on rotational grazing economics. A huge thank you to James McCann, NRCS Louisiana's Ag Economist, for sharing his expertise and insights with us. We truly appreciate your time and valuable contributions to this discussion. To catch part 2, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, sign up for our newsletter on our website, and follow us on social media at LGLCI. Stay tuned and thank you for watching.